The words came out in the worst possible moment, slipping through my defenses like water through cupped hands. We were fighting about something trivial, a forgotten dinner with his parents, I think, but the argument had escalated, gathering steam and dragging up old grievances the way arguments do when they've fermented long enough. "You know what, Daniel?" I said, my voice dangerously low, sweat beading along my hairline as I gripped the edge of our kitchen counter. "Sometimes I think I settled when I married you." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was absence. A void so complete that even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to fade away. Daniel's face didn't crumple the way I thought it might. Instead, something behind his eyes simply extinguished. He didn't yell. He didn't storm out. He just nodded once as if I'd confirmed something he'd long suspected, and walked to the bedroom, closing the door with a soft click that somehow hurt more than a slam would have. I stood alone in our kitchen, the aftermath of my words hanging in the air like smoke thick enough to choke on. The thing is, I didn't mean it. Not really. Not in the way it sounded. But words can't be unsaid, and some cuts never truly heal. We'd been married for 7 years. College sweethearts who everyone said wouldn't last. He was the steady one, the planner, the one who made spreadsheets for vacation budgets and remembered to change the air filters. I was the dreamer, always chasing the next big idea, the next adventure. We balanced each other. At least that's what I'd always thought. But lately something had shifted. I'd been promoted at work, suddenly thrown into a world of corporate lunches and networking events. Daniel had stayed in the same position at his architectural firm, content with the stability and the predictable hours that let him pursue his woodworking hobby on weekends. My salary had surpassed his, and though he said it didn't bother him, I sometimes caught him looking at me with something that resembled, not resentment exactly, but awareness. Awareness of a gap forming between us that neither of us knew how to bridge. My sister Ellie had called last week, bubbling over with excitement about her boyfriend Trent's latest business venture, some tech startup that had just secured major funding. "He's taking me to Tokyo next month," she'd gushed. "Just because he feels like it." Can you imagine? That kind of spontaneity. I'd made the appropriate sounds of excitement, but after hanging up, I'd looked around our modest 2-bedroom house with its carefully curated second-hand furniture and the small garden Daniel had built in the backyard, planting each herb with methodical care. It wasn't Tokyo. It wasn't spontaneous. It was comfortable, safe. And somewhere in the dusty corners of my mind, a treacherous little voice had whispered, "Is this all?" That voice had grown louder over the past week, feeding on small irritations. Daniel's habit of telling the same jokes to every new person he met, the way he still wore those faded college sweatpants around the house, his contentment with our routine. By the time we'd fought about his parents' dinner, the voice had become a roar, and out had tumbled the worst possible articulation of my restlessness. I waited for him to come out of the bedroom, rehearsing apologies in my head, but hours passed and the door remained closed. Eventually I curled up on the couch, pulling the throw blanket he'd bought me last Christmas around my shoulders, its soft weight suddenly unbearable. Morning came with harsh sunlight and the sound of the front door closing. I bolted upright, disoriented, to find a note on the coffee table in Daniel's neat architectural handwriting. "Staying at Mike's for a few days. Need to think." 3 sentences. 7 words. The period after think, like a tiny bullet hole through the paper. I called in sick to work and spent the day in a stupor, replaying our argument on an endless loop. When night fell, I found myself standing in Daniel's closet, breathing in the scent of his clothes, that mixture of laundry detergent, pine from his woodshop, and something distinctly him. I pressed his favorite flannel shirt to my face and finally cried, great heaving sobs that left me hollow. On the 3rd day I tried calling him. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail. "It's Daniel. Leave a message." I hung up without speaking. What could I possibly say that would fix this? Sorry I told you I settled? Sorry I made you feel like second best? Sorry I've been measuring our life against some imaginary yardstick? On the 4th day I came home from work to find him sitting on our porch steps, looking tired and weary. My heart lurched at the sight of him, at once achingly familiar and strangely distant. "We need to talk," he said, his voice rough as if he hadn't used it much in the past few days. I nodded, throat too tight for words, and followed him inside, terrified of what came next but knowing with absolute certainty that I deserved whatever it was. The house felt different with him back in it, both more and less like home. We moved awkwardly around each other in the kitchen, a dance of careful avoidance as I made coffee and he leaned against the counter, arms crossed like a shield across his chest. "I've been staying at Mike's," he said unnecessarily, his eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder. "I know." I handed him a mug, our fingers brushing briefly. He flinched almost imperceptibly, but I caught it, a tiny dagger to my heart. "Daniel, Let me talk first," he interrupted, finally meeting my gaze. His eyes were bloodshot, the familiar hazel dulled by exhaustion. "I've had 4 days to think about what you said and I need to understand. When did I become less? When did I become not enough?" The question hung between us, so earnest, so fundamental that I struggled to find words that wouldn't cause more damage. "You're not," I whispered. "You've never been less." "Then why say it?" His voice cracked slightly. "Why say you settled?" I sank into a chair, cradling my coffee like a lifeline. "I don't know. I've been feeling restless, I guess. Watching Ellie and her perfect life with Trent, seeing all these new people at work with their exciting stories. I started wondering if we'd gotten too comfortable. Too predictable." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Predictable. Right. Because stability is such a terrible thing." "No, that's not." I stopped, frustrated by my inability to articulate the shapeless discontent that had been growing inside me. "I love our life, Daniel. I do. But sometimes I wonder if we've stopped growing. If we're just existing." "And that's settling?" he asked quietly. I looked at him, then really looked at him. The man who had held me through my father's funeral, who had championed every one of my career moves even when they meant less time together, who built things with his hands and remembered everyone's birthdays and sang off-key in the shower. The man who loved me completely, consistently, without reservation. "No," I admitted. "That's not settling. It's just life. Real life, not some glossy Instagram version." He nodded slowly, but I could see the hurt still lingering in his eyes. "I knew from the beginning that you were out of my league," he said so matter-of-factly that it broke my heart. "The brilliant, beautiful Sarah Connolly with all her big dreams. Everyone was surprised when you chose me." "That's not true." "It is," he insisted. "And I was okay with it because I thought what I lacked in flash I made up for in substance. I thought being solid counted for something." "It does," I said, reaching for his hand across the table. This time he didn't pull away, but his fingers remained limp beneath mine. "It counts for everything." "Then why doesn't it feel that way?" He withdrew his hand gently. "I'm going to stay at Mike's a bit longer. I need space." The word fell between us like a stone. Space. The one thing I'd never wanted from him. "How long?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. He shrugged, rising from the table. "I don't know. Until I figure some things out." After he left, taking a duffel bag of clothes and his laptop, the house seemed to expand around me, too big and too empty. I wandered from room to room like a ghost, touching his things. The half-finished birdhouse on his workbench, the dog-eared paperback on his nightstand, the collection of beach stones on his dresser from our honeymoon. Days stretched into a week. I threw myself into work, staying late at the office, accepting every invitation to networking events and client dinners. I smiled and laughed and made all the right conversation, and all the while my wedding ring felt like it was burning a hole in my finger. Ellie called again, this time to complain about Trent working too much, canceling their Tokyo trip. "Sometimes I think he cares more about his company than me," she sighed dramatically. "You're so lucky with Daniel. He's always been so present." The irony wasn't lost on me. "Yeah," I managed. "He's great." "Everything okay?" she asked, finally picking up on my tone. "We're just going through some stuff," I admitted. "What kind of stuff?" I hesitated, the truth too raw to share even with my sister. "Just marriage stuff." "Well, you guys are solid," she said confidently. "Whatever it is, you'll work it out." I wanted to believe her, but as another week passed with only brief, stilted text exchanges with Daniel, doubt began to creep in. What if some words couldn't be taken back? What if some wounds went too deep to heal? Then one night I came home to find a small package on the doorstep. A book titled, The Architecture of Love, Building Relationships That Last. Inside was a note in Daniel's handwriting. "I'm trying to understand. Maybe we both should." It was the first real glimmer of hope in 2 weeks. I stayed up all night reading, highlighting passages, writing notes in the margins. Things I wanted to tell him, questions I needed to ask. By morning I had a plan. Daniel was trying, I needed to try harder. I needed to show him that he wasn't less, that he had never been less. I called in sick to work again and drove to Mike's apartment, heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. When Mike answered the door, his expression was guarded. "Is he here?" I asked. Mike hesitated. "Yeah, but Sarah, he's pretty torn up." "I know. That's why I'm here. Please, Mike. I need to see him." With a reluctant nod, Mike stepped aside, revealing Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, bent over his sketchbook. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face, followed by something unreadable. "Hi," I said, voice trembling slightly. "I got your book." He closed the sketchbook slowly. "Did you read it?" "Every word." I took a tentative step forward. "Can we talk? Really talk this time?" Mike grabbed his keys from the counter. "I'll, give you guys some privacy," he muttered, slipping out the door. And then we were alone, the distance between us measured not in feet but in unspoken words and misplaced expectations. We sat across from each other at Mike's kitchen table, two people who had shared a bed, a home, a life, now separated by 3 feet of scarred wood and a chasm of hurt. Daniel looked different somehow, thinner, shadows under his eyes, a new tension in the way he held himself. "You look tired," I said softly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Haven't been sleeping well on Mike's couch." "You could come home," I ventured. He shook his head. "Not yet. I'm still processing." I took a deep breath, clutching the book he'd sent me. "I've been thinking a lot about why I said what I said. And I think I figured it out." "Enlighten me," he said, not unkindly but with a wariness that broke my heart. "It wasn't about you, Daniel. It was about me. About this idea I had of what my life should look like by now." The words tumbled out, clumsy but honest. "I've been comparing our life to everyone else's highlight reels. Ellie and Trent's exotic trips, my co-workers' fancy cars, those couples on social media who seem to have it all figured out. And we don't measure up?" The question was quiet, but I could hear the hurt beneath it. "No, that's just it. We do. Our life is real. It's solid and true and built on something that matters. But I got caught up in this restlessness. This fear that I was missing out on something bigger, something more exciting." I reached for his hand across the table, relief flooding through me when he didn't pull away. "I didn't settle when I married you, Daniel. I found something authentic in a world full of smoke and mirrors." He ran his thumb over my knuckles, a familiar gesture that made my throat tighten. "Then why say it?" "Because I'm flawed and insecure and sometimes I forget to see what's right in front of me." Tears blurred my vision. "Because sometimes it's easier to blame someone else than to face your own dissatisfaction with yourself." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes steady on mine. "I've been doing some thinking too," he finally said. "About what I bring to this marriage. About whether I've become comfortable. Stagnant." "What do you mean?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You've been growing, Sarah. New job, new responsibilities, new people. And I've been, what? The same guy I've always been, doing the same things I've always done." "That's not a bad thing," I insisted. "Maybe not. But maybe I could be more." He squeezed my hand. "For myself, not just for you." We talked for hours, really talked in a way we hadn't in years. About expectations and disappointments, dreams deferred and paths not taken. About the subtle poison of comparison and the quiet strength it takes to build a life of substance rather than flash. "I miss you," I finally whispered, exhausted by truth-telling but lighter for it. "I miss us." "I miss us too," he admitted. "But I think we need to rebuild, not just repair. Figure out who we are now, not who we were when we got married." "How do we do that?" A small smile curved his lips. "Well, I've been thinking about that architectural firm in Portland that offered me a job last year. The one I turned down because it seemed too risky." My heart skipped. "You want to move to Portland?" "I want to consider it. It would be a challenge for both of us. New city, new jobs, new start." He hesitated. "Unless that's not what you want." The old Sarah might have balked at the upheaval, the uncertainty. But sitting across from this man who was finding his courage, I felt something shift inside me too. "I think," I said slowly, "that what I want is a life with you. Whether that's here or Portland or anywhere else." It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still hurt feelings to navigate, trust to rebuild. But as we left Mike's apartment together, walking side by side but not yet touching, I felt the first real hope since that terrible night in our kitchen. Daniel drove separately to our house, following my car like a cautious satellite. When we arrived, he hesitated on the porch as if unsure of his welcome in a space that had been as much his as mine. "Come home," I said simply, holding out my hand. After a moment's pause, he took it, his palm warm against mine. We stepped through the door together into the familiar space that now held the promise of something new. Spring turned to summer and our house became a metaphor for our marriage. Parts of it torn down to the studs, rebuilt stronger. Daniel took the job in Portland and we put our house on the market, sorting through 7 years of accumulated life. "Keep or donate?" Daniel asked one Saturday, holding up a chipped mug from our honeymoon. I ran my finger along the crack that had formed years ago. "Keep. Some things are worth more broken than perfect." He smiled at that, understanding the subtext. We were both learning to value the scars, the evidence of repair. The moving truck came on a Tuesday. As we stood in our empty living room, echoes bouncing off bare walls, Daniel pulled me into his arms, resting his chin on top of my head. "Scared?" he asked. "Terrified," I admitted. But in a good way. Portland welcomed us with rain and a small apartment above a coffee shop. Everything was temporary, transitional. IKEA furniture assembled late at night, takeout dinners on the floor, laughter bouncing off unfamiliar walls. Daniel started his new job with an energy I hadn't seen in years, coming home with stories of challenging projects and creative solutions. I found work at a local marketing agency, starting over as the new person, leaving behind the security of my former position and the temptation to compare myself to others there. The reset button had been pressed on both our careers, leveling the playing field. We explored our new city on weekends, intentionally getting lost, discovering hole-in-the-wall restaurants and quirky bookstores. We started traditions. Sunday morning pastries from the bakery down the street, Wednesday night art walks, impromptu dance parties in our tiny kitchen. "Do you miss home?" I asked one night, tucked against him on our second-hand couch. He was quiet for a moment, thoughtful. "I miss certain things. The maple tree in the backyard. My workshop space. Mike and the guys." He pressed a kiss to my temple. "But home isn't really a place, is it?" 6 months into our Portland adventure, Daniel's firm hosted a holiday party. I wore a new dress, feeling both nervous and excited to meet the people he'd been talking about for months. "Everyone, this is my wife, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a pride that made my cheeks warm. Later, as we sipped champagne by the windows overlooking the city lights, one of Daniel's colleagues approached us. "Your husband is quite the talent," she told me. "That sustainable housing project he's spearheading is revolutionary for the firm." I looked at Daniel, catching the flash of pleased embarrassment on his face. "I know," I said, reaching for his hand. "He's always been extraordinary." The words weren't just for show. In this new environment, I saw Daniel through fresh eyes. His quiet confidence as he described his projects, the respect his colleagues clearly had for him, the way he'd found his voice in this new chapter. That night, walking home through light snow, arms linked against the cold, Daniel asked, "Happy?" Such a simple question, but one that deserved a thoughtful answer. I considered the life we'd built and rebuilt, the lessons learned, the growth earned through pain and honesty. "Yes," I said finally. "Not because everything's perfect or exciting all the time, but because we're building something real together. Something that matters." He nodded, understanding. "Me too." Back in our apartment as we shed coats and boots, I caught sight of our reflection in the window. Just an ordinary couple in an ordinary moment. Nothing Instagram-worthy, nothing that would make my sister Ellie envious. And yet it struck me as beautiful in its simplicity, its authenticity. "Daniel," I said impulsively, "I need to tell you something." He turned to me, a question in his eyes. "I didn't settle when I married you. I reached higher than I thought possible and somehow, miraculously, you reached back." The words felt inadequate but necessary. "I'm sorry I ever made you feel otherwise." His smile was soft, a little sad, a little wise. "I know that now. And I think I needed to know I was enough, not just for you but for myself." We'd come full circle, those devastating words transformed through honest reckoning into something healing. Not erased, they would always be part of our story, but recontextualized, understood differently. Spring arrived again, bringing with it unexpected news. A baby due in November. As Daniel painted the spare room a soft green, I sat in the rocking chair we'd found at a flea market watching him work. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, noticing my contemplative expression. "How life never turns out quite how you expect," I said. "A year ago I was questioning everything about our marriage. Now we're in a new city, new jobs, about to be parents." "Regrets?" he asked, setting down his paintbrush. I shook my head. "The opposite. Gratitude. For the crisis that forced us to rebuild. For your courage in not letting me get away with that terrible lie." He crossed the room to kneel beside my chair, one paint-smudged hand resting on my barely visible bump. "There's something I never told you about those weeks at Mike's," he said quietly. "He kept telling me to just end it, that what you'd said was unforgivable." My breath caught. "Why didn't you?" Because deep down I knew it wasn't about me being less. It was about both of us forgetting to see the value in what we'd built. He smiled ruefully. "And because I'm stubborn. And because loving you has always been the easiest and hardest thing I've ever done." Later that night, as we lay in bed, Daniel's hand protectively curved around my stomach. I thought about the stories we tell ourselves and each other. How words can wound but also heal. How sometimes the most precious things are those that have been broken and carefully, lovingly put back together. "Tell me a story," Daniel murmured sleepily beside me, an old request from our early days together. I smiled in the darkness. Once upon a time, a woman told her husband she had settled for less when she married him. It was the biggest lie she'd ever told and the most important truth she ever had to face. He listened, eyes closed but alert, as I recounted our journey. The hurt and the healing, the distance and the homecoming. When I finished, he pulled me closer. "Good story," he whispered against my hair. "Especially the part where they live happily ever after." "Not happily ever after," I corrected gently. "Truthfully ever after. With all the mess and glory that entails." His soft chuckle vibrated against my back as we drifted toward sleep. Two imperfect people who had chosen each other, unchosen each other and then chosen again. This time with eyes wide open to both the limitations and the possibilities of human love. In the quiet of our new home, with the future growing inside me, I finally understood. There is no settling in love. There is only the courage to see clearly, to speak honestly, and to rebuild patiently what matters most. In the quiet of our new home, with the future growing inside me, I finally understood. There is no settling in love. There is only the courage to see clearly, to speak honestly, and to rebuild patiently what matters most.